Today we are joined by Brandon March. Brandon is a historian specializing in one of the darkest chapters in American history, the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. He is also currently working on a book titled Fear, Racism, and Agriculture: The Drive for Japanese Internment. Enjoy the episode. So, I'd like to start off with the story of Japanese immigration to the United States. We saw an influx of immigration from Japanese people late 1800s, early 1900s. So, what exactly is the reason that Japanese people are immigrating to the United States, and why are they sort of concentrating on the West Coast?
Sure, it's a great question. The initial Japanese immigration went from, the island of Japan to Hawaii initially. Late 1700s, more so early to mid 1800s, there were labor contracts. After Matthew Perry rediscovered, essentially, not rediscovered, but opened up Japan in 1853, they started sending laborers as part of an exchange agreement with the Emperor of Japan and the King of Hawaii for laborers for their sugar crops. So Japanese laborers would come from Japan, go to Hawaii, work out their contracts on the sugar plantations. Um, and during that time, there was a lot of uprising for issues such as conditions of work, how they were treated, their living conditions that they were given, and then the pay, of course. So during that time, there's kind of this ebb and flow of labor contracts. A lot of them got canceled. There was a change in leadership in Hawaii and in Japan. So it ended up the contracts just kind of fell apart in the later 1800s. It was during the same time that the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 went into effect on the United States, but primarily on the West Coast, which stopped all immigration from China and basically, unfortunately, labeled Chinese immigrants or workers as undesirable in the words of the society at the time. So there was a shortage of laborers on the West Coast. So you have a bunch of laborers in Hawaii that are Japanese of Japanese descent. They don't have any labor contracts anymore. There's work on the West Coast. So they jump ship literally and go to the West Coast, and they immediately get hired up and basically replace the Chinese laborers in those jobs on the West Coast. Railroad, mining, farming, a lot of service industry.
Yeah, was the gold rush kind of the reason for the Chinese immigrants that were working on the West Coast?
100%. That was the main reason. The gold rush in the early to mid 1800s in California, huge industry boom. The Chinese started coming in for the work that was plentiful. They built the railroads, they helped with the mining, they did all of it. But then you started seeing the growth and organization of labor unions around the same time, and labor unions were getting irritated that, there's a wage discrepancy. People were paying, the Chinese laborers much less than white laborers. And so they had to keep like, well, we can't pay you, hypothetically, just using round numbers, we can't pay you $50 an hour when we paid this other person $5 an hour. So we have to pay you $10 an hour. Like it's still more than they're making, but they're like, no, industry standards, we should be making this much. So there was a lot of friction that built up, which led to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. But almost in the same situation, Japanese immigrants basically took the place of Chinese immigrants in the same context.
So the reasons you kind of stated are more economic reasons for the Chinese exclusion. Was there a racist element there as well?
Yeah, there was. That was the easiest thing to fall back on. Now, if you think about the mindset of the United States at the time, we're gearing up to the Civil War, 1861, through 1865. So the mindset, unfortunately, is already there. You also have the push for westward expansion from the East Coast. So you already have this mindset of, oh, we have indigenous peoples in the country, but, essentially they didn't care. They just moved, just went from east to west. They didn't, so the respect for other people wasn't part of the mindset really. So it was just, who can we get to do the work? How little can we pay them? And then it's like, oh, wait a second. Now my wages are being infringed on. So then there was this whole friction that started with the whole situation. Um, so it was easy to label, these people with a racist undertone to justify, the racism that was being felt by society. People from, that side of the Pacific, Asian countries were seen as, barbaric. People didn't understand their culture, their ways, their belief. They spoke a monumentally different language than, a lot of people coming from Europe could at least recognize French, German, Italian, Spanish, things like that. But people were coming from the other side. They're like, this, we don't have any idea about this language. And then the other key thing that I think that's overlooked a lot is, in terms of the racial undertone, is that people from that part of the world are easier to recognize physically than your European descendants, right? So, like if you went into a room in 1855, if you went into a room that had German, Italians, and Americans sitting all at the same table and no one was speaking, they were just sipping coffee, you would have a hard time as a society, as a civilian in that time, picking out who's from what country. Now, obviously, if they started speaking, you could probably pick up on accents and things like that. But if you walked into a room with people from Asian countries, the idea at the time, the mindset of the people at the time was like, I can easily identify that you are from that side of the ocean, and I immediately don't like you, according to them, during this time. So that was a big factor in this as well.
Yeah, I always say people fear and they hate what they don't understand. And it's really just, it comes from a place of ignorance. That's why I think it's so important to be open minded and curious and, study various subjects just so you have a better understanding of the world and the people who inhabit it. So you avoid that ignorance. But these Japanese immigrants, they sort of replace the Chinese immigrants. Um, Something I find fascinating is Japanese culture. They have such an interesting culture, and especially back then, they still sort of had that old school Japanese samurai style culture, I guess. So, I guess my question is, how well did they assimilate in America?
That was actually one of the points of contention when it came to, when the war was breaking out, and then obviously when Pearl Harbor happened, was that the people on the West Coast didn't know or understand their culture because the older generation Japanese that came over in the late 1800s, early 1900s, they held on to their cultural beliefs. Now they assimilated to the United States in terms of your day-to-day stuff, and they would learn English the best they could, and they would do that kind of stuff. And they wouldn't push their beliefs on anybody else, but they did form tight-knit communities that were very geographically located. Los Angeles County, for example, when the war broke out in 41, they had the largest concentration of ethnic Japanese anywhere in the country, outside of Hawaii. Hawaii is a whole different, that's a whole different world down there. So they did assimilate the best they could, but their children, born in the 20s and 30s, they assimilated very well. They immediately adopted American style. They adopted American idealism. They went to American colleges. They went to English speaking American schools, but they still, respected their elders, and they still had that underlying tone of respect for the family that is, central in Japanese culture. So they towed the line between the two cultures, which I think is what really helped the older Japanese immigration community, survive, thrive, and excel in the society that they came to. They owned businesses, they became successful farmers, they were very successful as an immigrant community.
Yeah, they have the first generation Japanese immigrants are referred to as Issei, and then the second generation is Nisei, and the third generation or the grandchildren are the Sansei. I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly, but what are sort of the distinctions between those three generations that are referred to?
Usually it's the Issei, or the immigrants that are not, they're like first generation American immigrants, right? They're the first generation that came to the United States. American citizen or not, that's who they are, parents, grandparents. Um, and then the Nisei are their children, their offspring, and then the grandchildren after that. It's interesting that the Nisei were American citizens. Now it's an important distinction because when the internment actually happened, over 60,000 of the 125,000 that were interned were American citizens. So that's a pretty important distinction in my opinion, with the descendants being born in the United States.
Yeah, so it seems they assimilated very well. Like you mentioned, they form tight knit communities. They sort of hold on and maintain their culture. I was watching some documentaries, and they had the Japanese towns in California where they were all, everyone sort of knew each other in the community. It seems like that was sort of the vibe of those tight knit communities of Japanese Americans. But how, I mean, to go back sort of the racist undertone, how were the rest of Americans, white Americans in California, for example, on the West Coast, viewing these um, Japanese American communities? Because you mentioned they assimilate very well, they start farms, they start small businesses, they see a lot of success, and a lot of the white people on the West Coast sort of saw that as a threat or competition.
Right, they did, and this happened over time. Now, remember the labor unions that really started to coalesce at the end of the 1800s in California. They came into play again in the middle 1900s or early 1900s, in between World War One and the Great Depression, or I'm sorry, World War One and World War Two. So, you know, very, very brief overview timeline. Japanese immigration really kicks off in the late 1800s, early 1900s. People started to get a little freaked out because there are so many people coming in of Japanese descent from Hawaii and from Japan. So there's a little bit of pushback. So there's the Gentleman Agreement, I believe it was 1907, limiting Japanese immigration, but that didn't work because the Japanese that came to the United States were men. They were married to women in Japan, but the Gentleman's Agreement didn't outlaw bringing in your spouse or your family. So there was an even more influx of Japanese people coming from Japan. Um, and so gradually over time, and then there's a lot of influence as well from Japan and their actions. We'll get to that in a quick second. But over time, it was the threat of successful business, successfully navigating the laws and the attempted checks and balances that society was trying to put in place for Japanese Americans and ethnic Japanese. I'm thinking of the Alien Law Act of, I believe it was 1924, limiting land ownership of Japanese people, the Gentleman's Agreement in the early 1900s. Um, and just all these little regional just little laws and things like that, basically trying to keep Japanese immigrants from owning businesses, owning land, and being successful in any way, basically being a threat to the white community. Labor unions played a role in this as well, building up this momentum and this belief that we're never going to get, in their words, never going to get equal wages if we continue to have immigrants taking our jobs. So there was a lot of riots and a lot of pushback. And then you had several key leaders get elected, in San Francisco in particular, who really, really, really pushed the anti-Japanese agenda. You also had Hearst Media, which is a big newspaper company in the early 1900s, 100% anti-Japanese from the day that they started printing papers. So from the late 1800s all the way through the beginning of the war, you had this ebb and flow of, Japanese are seen as these barbaric, evil people, and then it kind of tones down a little bit because some laws go into effect, and they're kind of checked a little bit, and then something happens in the world like the Japanese Russian War, or their invasion of China, the atrocities that they committed in Korea, and then they sank one of our U.S. Navy ships during the whole Nanking incident. So there's a lot of things happening in the world that is kind of just plugging in just a little bit of doubt, a little bit of questions, a little bit of misunderstanding of their culture, misunderstanding about what's going on in the world, and gradually over time they were just seen as 100%, in the minds of the people, 100% threat to their way of life. It wasn't so much anymore at that point of they're taking our jobs, or they're too successful, they're farming better than I am, they're making more money than I am. That kind of went out the window just a little bit, but it was more so if they're a threat to our way of life just in general.
Yeah, those international incidents definitely just adding fuel to the fire. So there wasn't just the social persecution or oppression against Japanese Americans. There was also the political oppression by the U.S. government, um, with laws restricting land ownership and things of that nature. But you did mention the Japanese government. So what was the Japanese government's role in this?
So the Japanese government tried to keep things status quo. They wanted people to go to the United States to work, because they were having a population kind of issue. They were growing too fast. They needed people to go somewhere else to make money, and it solved a lot of problems for Japan. Plus, they wanted to keep trade open with the United States, as we were supplying them with all sorts of stuff, fuel, oil, things like that. So anytime that there was stuff going on in the United States, they were kind of torn between, do we support this, do we not support this? And they supported a lot of it all the way through the Gentleman's Agreement, which the Gentleman's Agreement, it's not really a law per se. It was an agreement between the president of the United States and the Emperor of Japan, saying like, stop sending people to the United States. We're going to limit it at a certain number. I think it was like, it was a low number. It was like 2,000 or something. It was very, very low. And Japan, not wanting to jeopardize, trade or anything like that, said, okay, great. So they stopped issuing passports for people to go to the United States. Um, However, there was a tipping point, and that tipping point happened in San Francisco, with the segregation of one of their schools in their districts. They segregated, their elementary and middle school and high schools, um, for Americans. I'm sorry, I guess not so much Americans because there are Japanese Americans, white Americans and Japanese children, two different schools. That was completely and 100% illegal in so many different facets of the government, even at that time. But our government was kind of slow dragging their feet, but we had an ambassador essentially in Japan talking to the emperor, talking to us, back and forth. And that really, really, really upset Japan. That really, really made them mad. They started issuing threats to the United States saying like, if you're going to treat our people in your country like this, we're going to treat your people in our country like this. If this continues, we've done military action before, we'll do it again. Speaking of, the Japanese-Russian War and things like that. And at this point in time, America hadn't seen, or up until this point in time, America hadn't seen the Empire of Japan as a military threat. They were just quote unquote rediscovered in 1853. Like, the Americans still saw them as quote barbaric, backwards. They were way behind the times. They were way behind in technology as, compared to the United States. That's what people believed at the time. Well, that belief was shattered when the Japanese Navy beat Russia in the Japanese-Russian War and then invaded China and Korea. So now this is all going on in a world of like, oh, the Japanese people actually have their stuff together. Like they have a navy, they're organized, they're not as backwards as we thought. They have technology, they have this, they have that, and they learn and adapt and progress very quickly. So it was at that point, I believe, that with the school segregation thing in San Francisco, that really turned a corner of Japan being like, we're done dealing with your stuff. We're not going to play this game anymore. Figure it out. And that's where the gentleman's agreement came into play. Everything got finally shut down by the president. The segregation thing went away, and everything kind of calmed down a little bit. Um, Up until about, the Great Depression, coming into, the issue with Nanking, um, and again their Chinese invasion right before the war started. Um, so Japan became very secretive, very like do this or don't, do this or we're going to retaliate. Um, but then supporting at the same time our immigration limits that we were putting into place.
Huh. That's interesting. So you think the segregation of schools and the deterioration of Japanese and American relations kind of sowed the seeds for the Japanese hostility that we saw in World War II.
I think it played a part for sure. I think that would be a question, that would definitely warrant some much deeper research. But I think it played a part. I really do because Japan was not ignorant to what was happening on the West Coast. Back to your question about the Issei and Nisei, there were also a subgroup of Nisei that were called the Kibei. Now these descendants of the Issei would go back to Japan, and go to college in Japan. Very small subset, but there were a few of them. And so there was communication back and forth. People go to Japan, they tell their families what's going on, they this, that, they'd write each other all the time. So there was a constant communication. So Japan knew what we were doing in the States. They knew about the laws, they knew about all of that. So yeah, I mean, it's a fair opinion to have that played a role in that for sure.
So there's already this hostility between Japanese Americans, white Americans, Japanese government, the US government. And then we see the outbreak of war. I mean, I think there's a case to be made that the Japanese invasion of China in 37, I believe, is really the start of World War II as opposed to Hitler's invasion of Poland in 39. I think there's a case to be made there. So, for the sake of the conversation, we'll say the outbreak of World War II was in 1937. How did that change um, the relations between the Japanese and white Americans?
Deteriorated quickly. This is about the same time that we were trying to pull ourselves out of the Great Depression. Labor unions were fully formed, very powerful, and they saw the Japanese community as an easy subgroup of citizens to blame for everything, right? Blaming everything that is going on in the world, blame them for the depression, blame them for no job, blame them for lack of, I mean, just anything you could think of. They were the scapegoat of the 1930s. Um, so it helped build I call it a powder keg in my research, the powder keg of Pearl Harbor, what happened after Pearl Harbor. It just set the stage, set the tone. It just kept building and building and building. The reports that were coming out of China and Korea about the things that the Japanese military were doing, you know, I mean, there were human rights violations. There's no question about it. And even the country of Japan now today would admit to that. They say, yeah, that was terrible. Um, and then the destruction or the sinking of the USS I think it's Panay, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, in 37, that is believed, to your point, as the actual start of World War II, because that was the first time that one of our ships was sunk by a foreign power, in another part of the world, Um, and there's argument now that the war actually didn't end until the end of the Korean War in the 50s. So there is a big discussion in the historical community right now, about when did it actually start, when did it actually end, and I wouldn't be surprised if by the end of my lifetime, World War II is considered 1937 to like 1953, give or take.
Wow. That's definitely an interesting conversation. I can see the beginning starting in 37, but that would be an interesting take to say it lasted all the way to what, 53.
Yeah, the end of the Korean War. Yep,
Yeah.
I think it's
Huh.
53. I might be wrong on that year, but
Yeah, I think you're right. Um okay. That's interesting. It so up until 37, a lot of the animosity was economic, maybe racist, but now we see the fear of the Empire of Japan as a growing military power. So now there's the military aspect to this, and there's all these Japanese Americans in California or in the West Coast who are seen as threats via espionage or disloyalty to America. So, is this when we start to see hysteria? I mean, what's the role of, say, propaganda in this?
I think the role of propaganda in this point is, it's fueling the fire. It's feeding the fire. Like I mentioned, the Hearst Media Group that's been, for decades prior to 1937, just stoking the anti-Japanese and, racist, anti-Asian sentiment. That was like their thing. That's what they did. That's how they sold papers. Um, at this point, they're in full force. Even Dr. Seuss, was printing comics, highlighting, Asian people as, um, saboteurs and dangerous and barbaric and things like that. Some of his earliest work, really support the America First movement that started about this time, in the early mid to late 30s, I believe. Or no, I'm sorry, that was World War One, but he revamped it in the 30s with his work. So yeah, it was that kind of propaganda. It was that kind of stuff that was coming out. And this is how people got their news, right? They would pick up a morning paper every single morning. They would listen to the radio broadcast throughout the day, and then the evening news on the radio, and that's what they got. And if you were a company like Hearst Media Group, you controlled all of it. So there were very few. I think in my research there was. I'm just going to use round numbers just to get a percentage. I think there was something like 50 different surveys done on 50 different newspapers in California, and I think only three were pro-Japanese. The rest of them were all didn't print a word of pro-Japanese stuff. It was all anti-Japanese sentiment about everything. Um, and those numbers aren't exact, but that's the ratio. You have 50 newspapers, maybe three said nice things. Um, so when we think of propaganda, media, and things like that, in our day and age, we're just swamped by it, right? We've got 1,000 TV channels. We've got every different type of news agency under the sun. We've got video that we can see instantaneously. We've got social media is a big one.
Yeah,
Um,
independent media such as
hmm
podcasts like this.
Yeah, independent media. You've got media that's backed by certain sides of the government, whatever. And back then you had kind of the same things in the terms of there were different newspapers that leaned one way and different newspapers that leaned another, different radio broadcasts leaned one way, leaned another. But I think during this time, politicians actually did a really good job of towing the line of maintaining order and security. They had the alien land law go into effect. They thought that that was going to solve the problem, keeping, Japanese people from owning land. Well, they found a loophole, and instead of owning the land, they just rented it, right? They just went out and leased it. And at this point in time, their children were American citizens, so they could go sign a lease, they could go get a bank account, they could start a business. Their parents may run it, but it's in their name. So there's a lot of loopholes that the Japanese community were finding, and they were still being successful. It was almost as if the laws didn't even matter because it didn't slow the immigrant community down at all. And it was this time that the media was really pushing that, saying like we can't stop them. They're growing crops better than we are. They're getting more land. They're doing this. They're doing that. There's successful businesses everywhere. Um, so that's what the media was really trying to do, and it was daily. It was daily in the papers all the time, and the people just couldn't get away from it.
Yeah, that's so fascinating to me. I mentioned earlier about Japanese culture and my interest in that, and that they seem to be so civil in all of this. I mean, despite the oppression and, as we'll get into in a bit, the internment, the whole time it seemed that they maintained a sense of hope and optimism throughout all of it. They, I wouldn't say willingly went along with it, but they didn't really resist. They maintained hope. They maintained loyalty, which is incredible. And you brought up America First, the America First movement, which I think is interesting because that's obviously something that is so prevalent today with the wars in Ukraine and the wars in the Middle East. There's a huge movement still in America of that American first mindset, and that we don't need to get sort of isolationists, that we don't need to meddle in foreign affairs. So I think that's just a testament to the importance of history and studying history, because stuff that still affects us today has a historical precedent. um, but going to your powder keg that you mentioned, that you talk about in your research, that was Pearl Harbor. So we have all of this fire brewing, and then the powder keg ignites with Pearl Harbor, which kind of changes everything. So how does Pearl Harbor change everything?
Right, it does. It really does. I mean, we all know the story about Pearl Harbor, December 7th, the one of the worst mornings in America, one of, not the, but one of the worst mornings, because in 9/11 there's a whole bunch of other stuff. So one of the worst mornings in American history, attacked by, the Empire of Japan. They blindsided us. I mean, I mean, it was a surprise attack through and through. We had no idea. I mean, you can get into the minutia of all the research done about how a radio operator saw these planes at this time and maybe this, maybe that. And the end of the story is they attacked Pearl Harbor and they sunk most of our battle or of our fleet, of our Pacific fleet. Like we didn't like what? Um, Thankfully, our main aircraft carriers were out on patrols doing some training or something in south of Hawaii, so they were out of there. Thankfully, otherwise we may have a different country to look at. But um, so yeah, since it was such a surprise, the government really wasn't ready for it, right? I mean, they had diplomats in the United States capital in Washington D.C. from Japan. Peace talks, quote unquote, peace talks were going on while the attack was happening. So immediately after that, there's two different narratives that start after Pearl Harbor. One of them is the Hawaii narrative, and one of them is the West Coast narrative. And one of the things that I don't see much of in the historical narrative is the study of Hawaii's reaction to Pearl Harbor after Pearl Harbor. Um, one of my students at the college I teach at, she's actually writing a paper on this. She's studying this whole angle. The difference is Hawaii didn't do mass internment. It's actually on my board here. Hawaii had 157,000 Japanese residents, which was 37.3% of the population. Now compare that to the West Coast. Everything from Washington, Oregon, California, Arizona, New Mexico, less than 1% of the entirety of the United States population was of Japanese descent. So narrative one, Hawaii, who was legitimately attacked by an enemy, did not intern their entire Japanese population. The West Coast, 4 months later in April, almost 5 months later, did intern all of the ethnic Japanese community. So there's your two narratives. Um, the West Coast, they immediately locked everything down. Within days, they froze all ethnic Japanese bank accounts, essentially freezing their entire economic structure. Um, They talked about instituting martial law just for ethnic Japanese only. They talked about, doing widespread arrests. They talked about all this stuff. But what did happen was the Department of Justice, or FBI rather, they did go around and immediately round up all. ethnic Japanese people that they saw as a threat or thought they could be a threat just for questioning, right? Several thousand people across many different states in the United States were arrested. They were taken to different, government facilities, questioned. A lot of them were released, but some of them never saw freedom again until uh, after the war was over, for no other reason than they thought that they could be a threat to the United States, even though they didn't have any evidence. The other thing that happened was over the couple of weeks after Pearl Harbor, they went around and seized any and all guns that they thought or knew that the ethnic Japanese owned. They had to turn those into the government. They had to turn in their radios. They had to turn their two-way radios. Radios that could receive only, they could keep those, but you can't. Radios that were, transceivers, you couldn't have those. A couple of other different things that they thought they could be used to signal a Japanese fleet, bright flashlights, just anything you could think of that they thought that they could signal off the coast, stuff like that. So there's a lot of that. And then what part of my research and my kind of my whole focus on my research is that the government purposely waited to evacuate the Japanese on the West Coast until they could secure their crops, right? My belief is that this is all agriculturally based, the timing of everything. It was during this time that they froze all their accounts that they realized that the Japanese community had a massive and huge role in food production on the West Coast in the United States. So after a few days of their accounts being frozen, they unfroze them and allowed them to operate on a limited cash flow basis. Um, because they realized that shutting down Japanese businesses froze the farming sector, basically shut down almost all of the agricultural business on the West Coast. You still had the big companies that were canning companies and things like that, but the Japanese were the main producers. They produced 20% um, of all of the, if I remember my numbers correctly, right around 20% of all of the food in the United States and almost 90+% of all of the produce produced in the state of California consumed by California residents. The food market in Los Angeles County was the largest food market in the entire country, right up until the Japanese were sent to internment camps. It has never come back. The Japanese owned basically a monopoly on the truck crop industry. They would come down to market and sell their food almost daily, and that's where people didn't go to big grocery stores where they had a produce section and all that. You went to the butcher, then you went to the market to get your fresh vegetables, and that's what you did. And most of those vegetables came from Japanese farms. So the government realized very quickly, like, we have a serious problem, and this is like within weeks of Pearl Harbor. And I think that really stopped the government from doing an immediate internment, is we need to figure out this food situation. So they let them go back to work, unfroze their finances, things like that. The military moved in, started building their facilities, started moving troops in to train them, but all the while keeping a very close eye on the Japanese community and trying to figure out what they were going to do because they really didn't know. Um, and in the meantime, in Hawaii, they instituted martial law. They rounded up roughly, I think, over the course of the entire war, it was just shy of 2,300 people that they rounded up for questioning in Hawaii. They interned roughly 2,200, I believe, on the islands of Hawaii. But those were people of special interest. They didn't do mass internment. They didn't do mass deportation. As a matter of fact, there is documented military records showing that ethnic Japanese helped raise ships in from Pearl Harbor and repair them and send them back out to battle.
Huh. So you're saying that the US government purposefully waited to intern Japanese Americans so that Japanese Americans would be able to harvest their crops so we wouldn't see necessarily like a food shortage or something like that.
100%. That's my whole shtick. And I found evidence of this with Secretary of Agriculture Wickard's papers. I've got all of his journals photocopied. And I found evidence of this in the USDA's meeting minutes in California, Washington, Oregon, and General DeWitt's. He's the commander of the Western Forces. He's the one that he's not the one that orchestrated the internment, but he's the one that carried it out. His right hand man, Colonel Benenson, actually wrote the whole thing and pushed for it, but that's a whole different that's a whole different thing. In his report, he said two things. He told Benenson that this program needs to be executed with zero impact on crops. And his final report said that they were able to safely secure 99% of all crops in California. So their plan was a success.
Wow. That's so interesting. And it's also, a testament to the success of Japanese Americans living in the United States? Because you mentioned they're what 1% of the coastal population, and they're producing 20% of the crops. That's an insane output for such a small number of people. I mean, just a quick side tangent. How responsible do you think Japanese Americans are for the success and growth of California? Because I mean, California now is the largest agricultural producer in the United States in terms of by state.
I think, in my opinion, I think they were a big contributor for sure. Because those all of their farms that they had, they didn't get shut down. You know, they harvested their winter crops, they planted their spring crops, they were removed off their land, and people came in as caretakers to continue the process. And then eventually, all those farms, most of them, and again, more research needed on this. But most of those farms were taken over by big agricultural companies, like canneries and things like that, and they're still in operation today. Just they're not owned and operated by ethnic Japanese. They're owned and operated by whatever corporation took them over. But without their successful farming tactics and techniques, um, California wouldn't be the agricultural mecca that it is. Even though the ethnic Japanese found ways around the restrictive land laws, they still were only allowed to lease the worst possible farmland in California. So you have a landowner that's like, you can't farm this. This is terrible. This is 50 acres of nothing. Like, you're never going to get anything to grow here. Over time, the Japanese were able to make that a very profitable farm. So maybe land that wouldn't have been even attempted to be farmed by other people, you know, the ethnic Japanese community figured out a way to make the soil fertile and do their thing, and now it's a farm. So yeah, I agree. I think, in my opinion, yeah, they did. They had a big impact.
I guess you could label Japanese Americans as sort of the pioneers of California agriculture industry. But going back to the difference between Hawaii and, say, the continental United States, they had a difference in mass internment. I mean, Hawaii is still a state of the United States. They still fall under that jurisdiction, and they're the ones who are actually attacked by the Japanese. So, what is the difference there? Why is Hawaii less strict on mass internment as opposed to mainland America?
Um, I think a couple of factors play into this. The first one is that Hawaii was not a state until 1959, so they were a territory of Hawaii. So I think that the people and
Got
the
my
the people in
facts wrong.
no, no, you're good, because this I think this is important, because the people that were in charge of Hawaii, the governor of Hawaii, Joseph Poindexter, was a big supporter of the immigrant Japanese population. And Admiral Kimmel, who was in charge of the Pacific Fleet up until Pearl Harbor, was also a big supporter of the ethnic Japanese community, because they were such a large part of the community. We were talking almost 40% of the entire population of the islands. And you're out there in the middle Pacific. You rely on your neighbors. You rely on your community. Like, you're in an island in the middle of nowhere. Um, so that's factor number one, is a very tight knit community, very well established understanding between cultures. Most of Hawaii was native Hawaiians, obviously, before the United States came in. So there's already a mindset of, there's a indigenous people that live here. We're from Japan, and then we've got people from America coming in here. So we got to all figure out a way to work together. Otherwise, this isn't going to work. So um, there was that, but there was also programs put into place. One of my favorite that I read about was these so-called morale committees, right? So as news would come out about different things going on in Japan, the Japanese-Russian War, the Gentleman's Agreement, the issue with, Nanking, Korea, China, all of that, these committees would have almost weekly meetings with community leaders, and these community leaders would get real information, facts, from different sources, the military, the governor, news agencies, independent news sources, radio broadcasts from other countries, because they were close enough to pick those up. And they would disseminate the facts and allow people to be like, hey, this is what's going on. These are the facts. Here's what we're doing about it. And so those community leaders would take that information back to their communities and spread the word through, churches, school events, anytime that you were, mixing and mingling with your community. And that really helped keep the propaganda misinformation down, and facts only. So there really wasn't a hysteria that built up in Hawaii. They were well aware of what was going on in the world, but they weren't having the same effect in Hawaii as they were in California. There were no land laws that went into place restricting, ethnic Japanese from owning anything. There wasn't any of that stuff, and there was a really strong sense of community between everyone and understanding. And even after Pearl Harbor, we still saw ethnic Japanese as part of the Neighborhood Watch program. We still saw ethnic Japanese who were police officers in Hawaii throughout the war. Um, and like I said before, there were ethnic Japanese who were helping rebuild battleships and rebuilding the Pacific Fleet and sending ships back out to fight. you know um and the other thing that I think is important is that when the attack happened and the days following the attack, any and all ethnic Japanese that were in a position considered sensitive by the United States government, such as an armed guard at a sensitive location at a military base, they turned in their guns and said, I understand that we're in a sensitive position. If you can use me elsewhere, do that. Like, I don't want you to think that I need to be in this sensitive position. So the admiral and all of his commanding officers just reshuffled people, put the ethnic Japanese in non-sensitive positions, like fixing ships, and just redistributed, people, because that's what they wanted to do. They understood that, like, look, I'm not here to threaten, so I'm voluntarily, saying, like, move me to another position. If I can help out somewhere else, I will.
Wow. I think you made such an important point about Hawaii and sort of what I mentioned earlier. People fear and hate what they don't understand. It seems that Hawaii had that level of understanding of Japanese culture. It was a very tight knit community. They understood one another. And therefore, that level of hysteria didn't arise because, they understood their culture and knew that Japanese Americans and Japanese people in American territories aren't conducting espionage and trying to undermine the United States. So I think that is probably, in my unsolicited assessment of it, is probably the main reason. But how did Japanese Americans react to Pearl Harbor?
They detested it. They were shocked. There's a lot of newspaper articles. There's a lot of journal entry that I read. There's a lot of personal letters and things that I've read from the ethnic Japanese community on the West Coast and Hawaii. They were shocked and appalled. They denounced it immediately. And they took to the streets. When there was parades or when there was any kind of event supporting the United States or any kind of bonds, things like that. They bought a lot of war bonds. They sent money to the government. They sent money to the military, and any chance that they could to show their patriotism, they did. They took down, if there was any families that still had maybe a Japanese flag visible, for whatever reason they took them down. Um, they didn't hide their culture, but they definitely took down any signs that would, make someone walking by their house question if whether or not they supported Japan. And they by and large did not. They were not happy with it. And they immediately saw the threat that event, brought on them living in the United States.
Wow, that's incredible. But nevertheless, this all um, forces FDR to enact Executive Order 9066, which sort of is very infamous executive order in American history, which forced the mass internment of, um, I guess, enemies within, but really just meant Japanese Americans. Um, so, what exactly is the story behind the executive order? And also, what's the legality of it? Because to me, it seems completely unconstitutional. I mean, it is. They're taking away Japanese Americans, American citizens' guns, which is a violation of the Second Amendment. They're mass incarcerating them. There's all sorts of law violations with the Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendments of due process. I mean, you're taking away their life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, which are ideals founded in the Declaration of Independence. I mean, how how is FDR able to enact this executive order?
The excuse that they used was basically wartime security. That's it. I mean, it's a blanket statement that was given out. It's wartime security. It's national security, stuff like that. But nobody knew, was there a reason for this? Was there not a reason for this? We don't know. Um, Even through today, there's still no documented, rock solid proof or evidence of espionage or sabotage or anything like that by any ethnic Japanese person throughout the war, even leading up to it, after the war, during the war, there isn't. Um, and it was challenged. The executive order was challenged in the Supreme Court after the war, and the Supreme Court upheld the justification. So, and to this day, they still haven't. I don't believe that they've overturned it. I think it's one of the things that they haven't quite. There's yeah, there's a law. There's something in the Supreme Court. I'd have to look it up to make sure my facts are right. But there is something that occurred with the internment camps and with Japanese removal that they haven't overturned. So it's still actually they still consider it to be okay and justified. And I believe it was 1966. Um, but the order was signed on February 19th of 42. And Roosevelt actually wasn't too keen on this whole idea, mostly because he couldn't find justification for it and he didn't see the reasoning behind it. There was a couple of groups of people that were trying to find a voice, and in the end, the labor groups, the unions, and the West Coast politicians were able to be louder than anybody else that said no. And then the other issue that pushed it through was that the ethnic Japanese community didn't didn't protest. They didn't rise up and say, no, this is unfair. They didn't, that's part of their culture, right? Respect your elders, respect your government, respect your country. And to them, the United States was their country, and it is. Um, so they just essentially just let it all happen. They said, turn in your radios. So they did. Turn in your guns. So they did. At the end of the day, when they said, evacuate to this location, you're going to live here for 4 years, they said, okay. They weren't happy about it, but they felt that it was their duty as American citizens or hopeful American citizens in the case of the Issei, that if the government wants me to do this to prove my loyalty, then I will. So on the Hill, you had, Secretary of War Henry Stimson wasn't too keen on this whole process. Saw the I don't want to say benefit of it, but saw the reasoning behind it of some people, but didn't agree with it. I would say the biggest person that I point my finger at in my research is Colonel Bendenson. He's believed to have actually written 9066. He was the liaison between General DeWitt on the West Coast, commander of the Western Forces, and Attorney General Francis Biddle. Um, he's from Washington. He is foundationally anti-Japanese. He's an isolationist. And he came up as a lawyer. He's got decades of law experience, so he was able to finagle a way to get this pushed through. Um, and with the backing of labor unions on the West Coast, agriculture groups, people that wanted to land grab the farms. The only thing that was holding him up was Secretary of Agriculture Wickard and his Food for Freedom program. He couldn't move prior to the spring harvest, I'm sorry, the winter harvest, because he would lose all those crops. They didn't have a plan on how to replace these farmers to keep the crops growing, so they needed something. So that's why I think it was delayed until February 19th. And then even then, the evacuations didn't start in full until late March, early April. And then what do they call it? The Zone 1, which was the predominantly agricultural area on the West Coast, wasn't fully evacuated and done until beginning of June. Um, and then full evacuation wasn't completed till I believe it was October of 42. So I think, he pushed it through as an executive order. They just used the excuse of wartime security. This is what we need to do. We've got too many assets in the West Coast. We've got too many rumors of fifth column activity. And then they use the excuse of, it's safer for the ethnic Japanese because we're afraid that, civilians are going to rise up and start committing crimes.
Hmm. That makes me appreciate when presidents resist sort of that warmonger pressure all the more. Because, FDR, like you mentioned, he doesn't seem too keen on it, but the pressure from everyone around him, forces him to do something like this. And for example, first one that comes to mind is JFK with the Cuban Missile Crisis. He has these warmongers around him who are pressuring him to hit that button and start war with Russia, and he resists that. And it's one of the great feats of an American president, I think, to resist that, because we could have easily gone into nuclear war with the Soviet Union during the Cuban Missile Crisis, but he resisted that warmonger pressure in his cabinet and from his advisors. And I think, when we see stuff like this where the presidents do give into that pressure, um, it highlights the times when presidents don't give into that pressure all the more. Um, you mentioned the Japanese response, and this is something that I find so admirable, is they didn't resist, they didn't protest. They sort of saw it as their price to pay as an immigrant and their price to pay to prove their loyalty to their country. I was watching a documentary and there was this little anecdote from someone talking, and they were a kid during the internment, and they asked their mom, I believe, why is this happening? Are we going to be okay? And she said, all immigrants have to pay a price, and this is just the price that we have to pay. Which I'm like, how during a time like this, when your own government is persecuting you, can you maintain that level of hope and optimism?
Right. I agree. And that's they did see it that way. And there was only one camp that saw any kind of riots or any kind of by and large disobedience, and that was Manzanar. Um, Otherwise, all of the camps were run and operated and managed by ethnic Japanese. They set up their own communities. They set up their own community leaders. They grew their own food. They had committees. They sent people to fight in the war. When the draft came around, by and large, that's exactly what they did. They said this is what we have to do, and if someone said, well, this is wrong, then the answer was, if this is what the government wants us to do to prove our loyalty, then this is what we're doing because we're not a threat to this country, and that's what they did. I mean, how else would you get 125,000 people, 120,000 people to voluntarily go to camps? I mean, there wasn't a single incident that I could find where, you know, somebody just refused and barricaded themselves in a house. They just didn't do it.
And if you look at the video from, when they're rounding up Japanese Americans from their homes, they're all wearing suits. They have their Sunday best on. It's insane to me. The the ad just the level of civility of Japanese culture. It's mind-boggling to me that in a time like that they can still uphold their culture like that. And also, doing my research for this podcast, one of the things that was jumped out to me was just sort of the level of ignorance and barbarity of it all. Almost, I mean, these are modern times. This is what, 80 years ago. We're in modern times. Everyone's wearing suits. We have modern technology, and still people are so ignorant and don't realize that what they're doing is ridiculous. I mean, they're rounding up Japanese Americans, completely unconstitutional. It just seems so kind of barbaric.
Yeah, it is for sure, and it's something that we need not forget. I can't tell you how many people I talked to when I was doing my research. I've been studying this topic for over a decade. I've talked to people at schools and different places and talked to friends and family about this, and I can't tell, like half of them, three-quarters of them, never even knew this happened. They had no idea. They're like, "What? We didn't do that." Yeah, you did.
I mean, I don't remember learning about this in school. Yeah. I know. It's crazy. I don't remember learning about this in school. I mean, it's a darker stain on American history. I would understand why um in American schools they wouldn't want to teach people and kind of cultivate a view that America's evil, but still, like, this is a pretty big deal that needs to be known about, and it has such repercussions for today. I mean, like I mentioned earlier with the America First movement, it's so important to understand our history because a lot of the stuff that happens is still permeating in society, politics, culture today. Um, so not only were Americans at war with the Japanese, they were also at war with Germany, with Italy. Was there similar prejudice against German Americans and Italian Americans? And were the concentration camps that are so infamous and evil and known today, were they known at this point? And did that come into the conversation like, hey, this concentration camp thing might not be that good of an idea?
It did not. I think the world at large, we were not aware of the concentration camps, the death camps until I think, I think after D-Day, if I remember correctly. Um, I'd have to fact check that, but I believe it was after the Allies made some significant inroads in Europe before we started finding the death camps. So they didn't know. They didn't have any idea. So there was no ability to make a comparison at that time. Um, but the idea of internment wasn't new. Great Britain, United Kingdom, they pioneered internment camps in northern Africa in the mid to late 1800s, and then in World War One they perfected it. They interned enemies, they interned civilians, anybody that they thought that was going to be a threat to their whole democracy. Well, I guess loose democracy at that time. Um, And then they used their worldwide network of territories to ship people around the world during World War One. You know, if their camps were full in the UK, they'd send them to Australia or India or wherever. So it wasn't a new concept. And there were also Japanese internment camps in Canada. So the United States wasn't the only people during World War II that were doing, um, concentration camps. And there's a in the historical community, there's a in the world at large, there's a not an argument, but a discussion about what's the right term to use for these Japanese internment camps, because by definition, they're concentration camps. However, society as a whole throughout the world attributes concentration camps to the Nazi death camps of Europe. So, but definition wise, they are concentration camps. So I need to recognize that here and say that, like, I do understand that there's definitely a conversation of it. Are they internment camps? Are they concentration camps? By definition, technically, they're concentration camps. They're not death camps. But the death camps and the Nazi camps in Europe, yeah, we didn't have any idea about that until towards the end of the war.
Was there similar prejudice against German Americans and Italian Americans, though?
But they were limited. So there were German and Italians that were rounded up by the government, but they were minuscule. The numbers were, I think Crystal City in Texas is probably the only place that processed any Italians or Germans, I believe. Um, the scale was unbelievably small. Um, and in 1966, it wasn't written. It was just written, to protect military infrastructure and areas of sensitivity, and any kind of wartime stuff. It wasn't written that it didn't say lock up all the Japanese, right? It just said make our area, make our stuff secure and hide our military secrets. In a very broad nutshell, that's what it said.
Yeah, it was sort of ambiguous. Like, hey, national security, military officials, you sort of do with that what you will.
So that did apply to any enemy that we were at war with in the World War II. But yeah, German and Italians, not even remotely close to, as much persecution. And back to what I said earlier, I have another student actually that's writing about this in their final paper. And the big argument with that is the physical characteristics of Italians and Germans as compared to, Japanese. They were readily identifiable. You walked down the street and you could absolutely, at the time, you could see someone that looked like, a Japanese person and be like, oh, they're not American. Maybe they are American because they were born here, but at the time you didn't even question it. The same with Italian and Germans. They could walk down the street. If they don't say anything, you don't know. And that's their argument. And then through my research, I read part of Henry Stimson's diary, and he said that they didn't believe that there was an issue with German and Italians in the country because the population was so low. They weren't highly concentrated in any sensitive area on the level that the ethnic Japanese were on the West Coast. And they believe that they would not be able to logistically handle a multi-coastal internment program. So they vetted the Italian and German citizens that they thought were a problem or could be a problem, and that was it.
I find that kind of hard to believe. I mean, there had to have been a lot of Italians in New York, which is probably a pretty important port city.
Yeah, and I question the concentration of Italians or Germans in Chicago, for example. So, but my student's still working on his paper. We'll see what he comes up with.
So what once they got to these internment camps, concentration camps, whatever how you want to label them, what were the conditions?
So they were bare bones. They were constructed very, very quickly. Think 2x4 frame with a barely a truss style roof, and wood siding and some tar paper on the inside. That's it. No insulation, no really foundation. Most of them were just sitting on cinder blocks. And then the biggest issue was the lack of privacy. I mean, they would have what we would consider the same size as a single wide trailer, as a barrack for these folks. And they would stick 8 families in there. And there's no division. There's no walls. There's like one stove in the corner. You don't cook in there because there's no kitchen. You have a mess hall you go to, like a military facility. Um, and they didn't give him anything. You gave him, a cot. That was it. So it was up to you to figure out how to keep warm in the winter, keep cool in the summer. If you wanted to grow some food, figure out how to get your own seeds. And we'll bring in food, and you'll cook your own food in the mess hall. We don't care about cultural specific foods, diets, anything like that. They put them on a military style diet, more calorie counting kind of diet. Um, so it was pretty bad, and so the privacy was really bad. There was none. Um, the latrines and the showers and everything like that, they weren't segregated by male female, so you had a lot of issues of people peeking over the stalls, as it were. And that in the Japanese culture, that's a massively big issue, because they valued their privacy, they valued their tight-knit family culture, and it was gone. And then the other part of it, with the conditions, was they had the family culture and all of that, but when they went into the camps, their kids stopped eating with them. They stopped having family meals because you ate in a mess hall, right? So it was like a cafeteria style, like in school. So that fell apart. Their family dynamic, their culture started to get eroded. Um, and then you had to deal with, and the camps were also located in the worst parts of the country that you can conceive of. I visited a couple of camps. One was a mache in what's called the Granada internment camp, but it's a mache in southeastern Colorado, and they have a replica bunker, or not bunker, a replica barracks there. And I toured it and I walked around it, and I'm like, this is terrible. Like, I mean, the dust is coming up through the floors, the windows aren't sealed, like you can see through the little cracks in the walls. Like, there's again no privacy, there's no walls, it's just a big open room. So yeah, it was pretty terrible. I mean, there's no way around it. And the assembly centers were even worse. So
That's awful. I mean, I saw that the bathrooms and the showers, they were public showers, public bathrooms. There's no sort of separation between toilets. They're all just kind of toilets lined up on the wall, public showers. But you say that they weren't even separated by sex. It was all just one big shower area.
right in the beginning, they didn't even think about it. They just gave you buildings that said, "Here's your showers, here's your latrines, have at it." So in the beginning, there wasn't any. They were like, "What's going on? I don't understand." As the camps got established, and the Outbreak Japanese started to become in charge of the camps, of organization and things like that, that problem was rectified. Um, but still, they had to take turns because there was limited buildings, right? So you had one building for showers, one building for latrines, and it was like, okay, they set up schedules essentially of like who could shower when and what was going on, and all of that. So yeah, it's I don't know, it's pretty terrible. I mean, there's no nice way to say it. It was bad. It was not good.
Yeah, no, that's barbaric. I mean, I value my alone time and privacy very much. I know that's a huge aspect of Japanese culture. I can't imagine how awful that must have been. And what, they were there for 2 years, right?
So the last internment camp closed, believe it or not, it was Tule Lake, and it was March of 1946. So yeah, the camps were open. Yeah, the last camp closed in the 46, which obviously we know the war
So
ended
some of
in
them were there for close to 4 years.
4 or 5 years. Yeah, yeah, 4 years. Yeah. Um, so yeah, and the government said, we're going to close the camps and you're going to be all shut down and everything's going to be great, and they didn't. So there's still a lot of questions as to why. Um, I think part of the reason is that a lot of these folks didn't have anywhere to go. They weren't welcome anywhere. Once the internment camps were shut down, once the war was over, all of that kind of stuff, um, nobody wanted them anywhere. So they didn't have anywhere to go. They didn't have they didn't have anything. All of their land was seized, their homes were seized, their possessions were seized and sold. Like they had nothing. They got $40 and a bus ticket, I think is what, or $10 and a bus ticket, I think is what they got.
That's awful. I mean, how did they assimilate back into everyday life and culture afterwards? Because they're kicked out of their homes, they're kicked off their land. When they come back, someone else is living in their house, someone else is farming their land. I mean, how do you assimilate back into your normal life after that?
That's an area of research that is weak, I believe, in the historical community. My research shows that they didn't have anything. Well, a small percentage of people had very nice neighbors, and they did and were able to go home, and their house was still there. Their neighbors took care of their house. Their neighbors sometimes bought their house because their house was being sold at pennies on the dollar, so they could you get a full house for 10 cents or whatever. I mean, it's like that's an extreme example, but you get what I'm saying. It's But they had nice neighbors, and the neighbors took care of the houses, and they just came home and they moved back in. And then there was the problem of finding a job because nobody wanted to hire anybody of ethnic Japanese origin. Um, so it was a very tough, it was a tough issue. And what ended up happening was the redistribution of Japanese communities all over the country. The population, they couldn't just move back to Washington, Oregon, California and go back to their lives. They didn't have any farms, they didn't have any land, they didn't have any property. So they took their bus ticket, and a lot of them, they just chose a different part of the country that was accepting of ethnic Japanese, and that's where they went. Eventually, a lot of them did move back to, the areas, after some time has gone by and things like that, and established communities back in California and things. But yeah, they came home. There's, extreme stories of their houses being burnt down. Racial slurs written on their garage doors with spray paint. Um, all of the communities made it very, 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 very clear that they did not want ethnic Japanese people to come back to their community. They just didn't. So, I mean, they did what they could.
Yeah, I think that's 100% a testament to the resilience of Japanese culture that they were able to bounce back from that. I mean, sort of any other people probably would have crumbled from that. I mean, can you imagine the setbacks? It's hard to comprehend. Um, how has the narrative around that sort of evolved since World War II? I know there was this red dress movement in the 70s and 80s. Sort of what's been the going historical narrative since then?
Yeah, the historical narrative has been, yeah, it was a mistake. We shouldn't have done it, but it was necessary because it was wartime, and that was pretty much the shtick for 20 years, right? 20, 30 years. And then Roger Daniels, who's, um, I consider him the premier, and this is my own opinion. I consider him the premier uh, Japanese internment researcher. Unfortunately, he passed away just a few years ago, but I don't even know how many books he's written, 60 on this subject. Like this guy is unbelievable. I've read almost all of them. And in the 60s and 70s, he really started poking around a little bit deeper and trying to identify and highlight individual actions of politicians and people that made the decisions. Um, but even he didn't get past yeah, it was wartime security, it was this, it was that, it was required, it was necessary, and nothing really we can do about it. Um, but then in the 80s, you had all these descendants from Japanese families. And here's the other kicker on this whole thing too, is and it plays into this. The Japanese families, they didn't talk about this. Like when they left the camps and they got their life back, when they built their life again, because they didn't get their life back, but when they built their life up again, the Issei and Nisei didn't talk about this to their children and grandchildren. They didn't talk about it at all. Only in the 60s, 70s, or 80s, or in the 80s, 70s, and 80s, when the grandparents started to get of age, like, elderly, and kids started asking, like, wait a minute, what is going on? What happened here? And then there's so many different stories about these grandkids or grandma, what? Grandpa, what? They just mind blown. They didn't even have any idea. So they're very private people. They're very culturally, tight knit people. They didn't want to talk about it. But then the redress movement basically pulled it out of everybody. And then now there's, the Densho Encyclopedia. What's Densho? It's an organization in Washington. They've been doing oral history recordings for over 10 years, I think, trying to get stories of people before they pass away of what happened. So the redress movement forced the government to, um, identify that they made a mistake, that what they did was wrong, that they apologize for it, and then they give some sort of, reparations, right? Um, there's still no solid number on how much was taken from the ethnic Japanese community. Some say it was billions. Some
I
say it
don't
was
even know how you would
tens of
quantify
billions.
that.
Yeah. I mean, the farms, as successful as they are now with the corporations that own them now, I mean, hundreds of billions. I have no idea.
And I
Um,
mean, not just monetary assets, but you're taking years from people's lives. Like you can't
mhm.
you can't quantify that.
Right. I mean, they robbed generational wealth. If you think about it, when the war happened, there were some Japanese families that were on their third generation of living in the country. They had grandkids that were helping manage the farm. So that's a generational wealth that's gone. So the redress movement went through finally, I think it was 88, if I remember it correctly, the Civil Liberties Act. 20,000 dollars to every surviving member of Japanese internment, and a formal apology by the United States. But again, um, Supreme Court still hasn't overturned. There's a law, and I'm racking my brain trying to remember exactly what it is. They haven't officially overturned it yet, so there's still a sneaky little Supreme Court thing in there that still supports the internment. Um, but I don't think it's enough, right? I don't think it's enough. It just isn't. If you look at, I'm gonna make a plug about Germany real quick. Germany, we all know that they were the orchestrators of the death camps, right? World War II, there's some really bad stuff that that country did. There's a lot of different minutiae we can get into about how, why, who, what, when, where, all that kind of stuff. But the point is, that country does not hide from it. They teach it in schools to everyone all the time. They never let any citizen in that country forget what happened because they say if you forget, you'll do it again. They've owned it. They apologize for it. They know that they can't ever give back what was taken. But their goal is to educate and keep it alive in the sense of always remember so it doesn't happen again. And I think that that's an attitude the United States should take about all sorts of different topics, including, and but not limited to, Japanese internment.
Right. This also, this is where we start to get into the philosophical realm of ideas, not necessarily in the concrete history anymore. The Civil Liberties Act of 1988 raises some very interesting questions about reparations. I mean, does the government have a responsibility for reparations, say, about slavery, about the abuse of Native Americans?
I would say yes. I would say that the government has a really large responsibility to a lot of people that were wronged in more ways that I could list in the time we've got, and I don't know I don't know what's hanging them up. I really don't. But again, it's a fine line to toe. It's like how far do you go? How far do you not go? Is an apology enough? No. You can apologize all you want, but if nothing changes, then what's the point, right? So yeah, more needs to be done. What that is, I'm not in a position to, I'm not in a powerful enough position to say that yes, we can do this, we can do that, but I will say that not enough's being done. Not enough is being recognized. I mean, if we're talking about, I think you said indigenous people, that's a hole in the research. Like as a historian, I cannot believe how limited the research is on indigenous peoples of these of this continent. Like it just blows my mind. And then what happened after the Europeans came to this country is kind of like, I mean, it's almost like cloak and dagger. It's like you gotta specifically search for stuff to find it, and then even when you do, it's very vague, and all this kind of stuff. It's not detailed. So yeah, and then the issue with slavery, of course, in the early times of this country, that is very well researched. I mean, very well in depthly researched, but I still don't. I'm going to use Germany again as an example. I really don't think we've got to that point yet where, as in Germany, as an example, it's not that they force feed you, but you cannot forget. They won't let you forget. And because of that, you won't do it again. Like you learn, you understand, you recognize, you apologize, you pay for it the best you can in whatever ways that comes about. And then you all move forward together, all the while working together, never to let it happen again, ever, not even a little bit.
I mean, to play devil's advocate, at what point is it time to move on and stop bringing up, dredging up these discussions and about racial divide and kind of fueling the fire? At what point do you try to move on to a better future?
That's a good question.
Because I mean, if you're
I
just
think that
talking about old issues, it's just going to fuel the fire of racial divide. For example,
sure,
with slavery.
yeah, absolutely.
Like it's very important to remember. I mean, I'm
Yeah,
I've devoted my life to American history. Like I truly believe, especially the darker stains on American history. Like I truly believe it's important to study and remember these. But at some point, you have to move on in order to focus on a better future, as opposed to just dredging up these old issues and entrenching that racial divide.
well, I don't know. I go back to Germany again. I mean, they've been able to get to a point where yes, they teach about it, yes, they talk about it, the Holocaust, and they talk about all the things that they've done in their past, but it's not done in a way that necessarily dredges up everything. It's done in a respectful way where it respects both cultures, and it's done in a sense that we need to understand the what and the why, so it doesn't happen again. Obviously, I've said that a couple times, but at what point? the word respect keeps coming to my mind. I keep thinking about respect. I think once we get to the point where we can respect all cultures now, day to day, every day, all the time, and there's a level of respect and equality across the board, then I think at that point maybe you can transition to more of an education of, this is what happened, this is how it happened, this is why it happened. We're not gonna let this happen again. Okay, great. This class is gonna be, 3 months long. We're gonna learn about all this kind of stuff, and then we're gonna move on to another topic. But I don't think
So
we're
you
there
don't
yet.
think we haven't reached that point?
No, not in this country. No, I think we still need to, there's a lot of things we need to work out. There's a lot of things that we need to recognize. There's a lot of things that we need to research. There's a lot of things that we need to, face and deal with and process. And we're just not there yet. I'd like to think we're going in the right direction. Still a lot of work to be done. I mean, if you think about it, using slavery as an example, um, I mean, I've studied slavery a little bit, not as much as the internment, so help me out with my years, but I don't think the United States has been a country longer than slavery was an institution in this country. I think slavery has been around still longer than we've been a country.
Yeah, I think slavery started in 1619 in this country or in this land. Um, so that's 1619 to
Yeah,
1865,
so in the United States is, I think, just past that now.
246 years. We're at no, we're at two since 1776. We're at 248.
Yeah, so
Who knew we'd be doing math on a history podcast?
yeah, you're good.
So
So,
yeah, you're right. I
but I
mean,
mean
we
that,
haven't.
yeah, that's a big, I mean, that's a big argument. That's a big deal. I mean, that means a lot to a lot of people saying that this land, this occupied land, as established as the Americas or whatever you want to call it when the Europeans came over, that institution has been around longer than this place has been a country. Like, I kind of in my brain, I'm thinking to myself, like, I can see the balance of like, okay, well, when we're finally a country where that has been illegal for longer than it was legal, maybe that'll change some people's minds. So I think about a lot of different factors, but I just I don't think we're there yet. I think we're on the right track, but we're not there yet. We still need to talk about it. We still need to process it. We still need to address it.
That's true. Maybe a call to action for the historical community to study these darker aspects. But I mean, to quote Nietzsche, when you stare into the abyss stares back at you. So when you study these dark topics, the abyss stares back at you. But I mean, as far as reparations, to push back on that, wi- the reparations for Japanese Americans who were interned was directly to the Japanese Americans who were interned. If you were to do reparations for slavery or Native Americans, I mean, these people, while their people historically were persecuted, these people aren't the ones who had to go through that. And then you're forcing taxpayers who are not guilty of those crimes to pay for it.
Right. I think that's a solid argument. Where do you draw the line in that regard, right? Um, I don't have an answer for that, honestly. I am I'm a historian that, studies a lot of different things, and the answer to that question, I think, is
Left to politicians, maybe.
I no, I mean, I question how much we should leave to politicians because a lot of individual opinions come
That is a
in.
very good question to ask.
I mean, if you look at Japanese internment, a lot was left to politicians. And while the overall internment of the Japanese was universally, accepted on the West Coast, the East Coast thought it was terrible. But, it's the politicians. It's the politicians made it happen.
That is a
When does
very
rep
good point, my friend. That
when
is a
does
very good point.
reparations stop? I don't honestly know because I see arguments on both sides. I see it for both ways. Because you could take an ethnic Japanese family that lost a 250-acre farm in California, take them back to that same land today, and that 250-acre farm is now 2,500. And it's a primary source for tomatoes for a local cannery, and that farm makes, I don't know, I'm making up numbers, 150 million a year, I don't know. And so the family could say that would have been ours. And then it's like, okay, well then how do you quantify that?
That's the question: is how do you quantify reparations? But as far as politicians go, I wholeheartedly agree with you. I think the less the less involvement, the better. But to sort of linger on this, I love debating and discussing sort of ideas and the philosophy and kind of having my head up in the clouds. I think this Japanese internment experience teaches a lot about the balance between national security and civil liberties, and the fragility of liberty in times of crisis and hysteria. We have freedom in America. We have a constitution. We have a Declaration of Independence with these ideals we were founded on. But that stuff's very fragile, and a lot of people take that for granted.
Yes, it is, and it is very fragile. And in terms of the internment, I look, how do you balance national security with civil liberties? There's an example of it between Hawaii and the West Coast, right? I mean, could you put the entire West Coast under martial law like they did Hawaii for 4 years? I don't know. I think there's a couple of questions about logistics due to population differences, but um, Hawaii didn't intern all of the ethnic Japanese, and there were enough Japanese people on the Hawaiian Islands they could have taken over those islands and had Pearl Harbor. They could have seized Pearl Harbor, and the Japanese could have sailed into port, no problem. Like they were in positions of power that they were in I mean, they were only 40% of the population, but I mean, you could do it, but they didn't. Um, and Hawaii treated them differently. Hawaii said, "We're not going to do this. We're going to respect your civil liberties as much as we can. We're going to respect your freedoms as much as we can. And instead of doing all of that, we're going to institute martial law," which a little bit drastic, but honestly understandable, right? I mean, would you rather martial law or we lock you all up for 4 years? You know. And in addition to martial law, we're also going to let you keep your jobs, right? If you're a cop, we're going to let you keep being a cop. We may ask you some questions. We may look into your background. We may watch your finances a little bit, but if you have nothing to hide, which they didn't, and obviously their culture was like, yeah, go for it. I don't care. Um, and then you have the West Coast where you locked everyone up for 4 years, you know. Um, so I think those are two drastic examples. I honestly think Hawaii did better with balancing between the two, and I think that's because they had less hysteria, more understanding, less fear. And I honestly think in an island community, you rely more on your neighbors than say, somebody who lives in, I don't know, Kansas. I don't know, I'm picking a state, I have no idea. But it's a whole different mentality when you live on an island in the middle of the Pacific. You really do rely on your friends and neighbors. You really do.
You sound
Um,
almost like an anarchist advocating for these small, tight knit communities.
No, but it's very evident in the research when you read journals and things about from people from Hawaii, and you read the journals about people that visited Hawaii. Right after Pearl Harbor, they sent a whole bunch of soldiers and Navy personnel down to Hawaii and their families to reinforce the island and really just bring this up to like, let's go. And there were journals from people coming from the mainland that could not believe that there were white people, in their words, white people getting their hair cut by Japanese women. They just couldn't believe it. They were just blown away. They're like, this is not right. They were so upset. There was a couple of journal articles I read that they were so upset. They wanted to move back to the country, to the United States, because they said that the tolerance, acceptance, and the ethnic equality that is present in Hawaii is too much to bear. They didn't want their children growing up in a world like that. Like that is such a drastic difference between the two parts of America. I mean, Hawaii may not have been a state till 59, but they were still, if you were born in Hawaii, you're still an American at that time. Like,
Exactly. Yeah. Man, that's why I think it's so important to study history, especially for politicians and decision makers, policymakers, because you can look back at history and take these issues and see what went wrong and what went right. When an issue came up throughout history, what action was taken where it turned out right and the right choice was taken, and what action was taken where it turned out badly. And I think that is so important to understand because it is applicable to policymaking today.
I agree. Yeah. To make decisions moving towards the future, one only has to look at the history, right? I mean, it's all basically happened before in one form or another. Um, and if you forget about your mistakes, you're just going to make them again, you know? I can almost promise you Germany's never going to do that again. I don't think we'll ever see that happen again in history, at least in
Yeah,
Germany. You know what I mean?
that's very true. That
It's
is very true.
not going to happen.
Well, Brandon, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show. This was a wonderful conversation. Thank you for enlightening me about Japanese internment. I'm glad we got into some debate about sort of the philosophical ideas about this all. Thank you for doing the work you're doing, illuminating these darker chapters in American history. Like you said, a lot of these aspects are of American history are very under researched and not well understood, especially Japanese internment. I guarantee you most Americans don't actually know this happened. So thank you for the work you're doing. Thanks for coming on the show today.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thank you for having me. Have a good day.